very stimulating, and the other comrades who've also made valuable contributions. That's it.
Thanks very much, Ed. Matt's got his hand up again. Is there anybody else that hasn't spoken that wants to speak at this moment in time before I bring Matthew in? No? Okay, Matthew.
Okay, well, I think that coming after that, there's some basic points. One, I think what we're seeing importantly is the integration of the world. You're not seeing competition in those terms. What you're seeing is the integration of production in the world, such that, I mean, as an example, for instance, the recent strike in South Korea by truckers actually threatened to bring down a whole series of production across chunks of the world, including China and other places that were dependent on the output from Korea that the truckers were refusing to move. And it's not the problem that this produces, of course, is the fact that there isn't. I mean, if the production in key questions tends to be limited to a small number of facilities, and there isn't spare capacity. And this actually gives the working class an enormous power, because if it starts stopping some of these things, the capitalist hasn't got any alternatives. And we can see, you can see the impact in Russia, of course, is the fact that the Russian economy was based on extraction, still actually is the major producer of nickel, it's a major producer of copper, so the prices of those two things have gone absolutely crazy. It's a major producer of, as people said, of fossil fuels, and of course, refined fossil fuel, actually the biggest producer of diesel. For movement around the whole of Europe, and at the same time between Ukraine and Russia, two of the biggest exporters of food, and the impact of that on the rest of the world is huge, as we see. I think the second point is that the war in Ukraine is not a war for markets. It simply isn't. It's a war about domination. The Americans have been scheming to take over Ukraine since at least, the coup in 2014, and probably well before that. But they actually carried it out in 2014. But staging a coup with a load of fascists and taking over the Ukrainian state, and that leads to where we are now. They intend to take over Ukraine as part of the process of trying, as has been pointed out by Brzezinski in his book, The Great Takeover, breaking up Russia and destroy Russia. The problem for the Americans, of course, is they understand their hegemony. It still exists and still is there. We should absolutely say that the US is the hegemon. There's no question of that. But it is under threat and it is in decline. And it does, the point is they're actually nakedly and openly saying they want a war with China. And this is being taken on by all the sort of crazier elements in Britain and elsewhere, including the military, and saying, we need to prepare for war for China, which is what clearly they're aiming at. I think the other thing, of course, is the definition of there's numerous other questions here, but a definition of China. China's clearly not very odd. It's clearly not purely capitalist. It clearly has a very large capitalist sector and it has some very large capitalists, but it's actually run and dominated by the Communist Party and a strong element of central planning. Obviously on the basis of as you say, an extreme exploitation of huge chunks of the working class. Hence why, for instance, whole chunks of industry in large chunks of the world have been given over to the Chinese, because they can control the working class better than everybody else. They have a stronger control of the working class. So they just say, well, you can do all this stuff. We'll get rid of it. You can do it. So hence China is now the biggest exporter of manufacturers in the world, as we can see. But it's that element of central planning that allowed China actually to reflate the world economy after the collapse of 07-08. And it was the Chinese that are actually critical to that actual resuscitation of capitalism itself on a world scale. Odd and perverse as though that might be, but that's what happened. And the Chinese, laid down, as pointed out, during that period, laid down more concrete than had been seen in the whole of human history. As part of that process. And so, it's actually sort of, all these odd contradictions which now exist, and China happens to one of them. The problem being, as I say, is that what into is a lack of any kind of political understanding of what's going on. And the core factor here is the degree of consciousness or lack of it within the working class and the left.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. No other hands up at the moment. Does anybody want to ask any quick questions or add anything? Otherwise, what's the mind? Oh, David. Oh, right, David. You just beat Ed to it.
Look, I apologize if I'm coming in and I certainly don't want to cut across any new points into this, but I hope I introduce some new points myself here. And that what I want to introduce the question of the politics, of imperialism in this particular context. In my view, and I think it's a general view within the comrades in the international network that we represent, that Putin intervened in Ukraine because of the threat of revolution at home. In other words, imperialism is, you can't read it off from markets, from trade barriers, from the economic alliances alone. We have to understand it, and I think Themos pointed to this, the combination of revolution and counter-revolution, and it was a part of worldwide counter-revolution. In other words, Putin felt driven because of the revolution opening up in Belarus, and later the insurgency in Kazakhstan, to be able to intervene and create a state of war. And as we know, Thatcher only survived really because of the war in the Malvinas and the sort of khaki elections which are followed. And Putin has been remarkably successful in creating ideas of ethno-nationalism, of showing that Russian culture, Russian language, Russian heritage is totally hegemonic in Eastern Europe. And in doing so, he's polarized nationalisms from all Eastern European countries. There's not one country in Eastern Europe which doesn't now want to join NATO. And NATO is a supremely reactionary power. And yet Putin has achieved that through having to intervene in his own way because he feared revolution at home, creating a state of war, a state of panic, and a state of total domination over all politics so that he intervenes as decisive in every trial, every single repression of any anti-war person and so forth. He controls all of that. It's a ramshackle but effective administration of Russia by the KGB. And I think we have to understand this politics to understand, how imperialism actually works. To counter that, now we've seen the rise of Ukrainian nationalism, which probably was not a factor in the past. People who lived in Ukraine were Russian, were sort of Ukrainian, all kinds of different identities, but now become fused in one identity called, Ukrainian. Now, I just want to return to one thing in relation to Europe and to the rise and of imperialist interventions in Ukraine. And that is the fact that I think Olivier pointed to this, that the EU is the greatest market in the world. They have tried to incorporate Russia, and the fact they've succeeded to their disadvantage in incorporating Russia's exports, in particular its oil and its gas, right into its very guts, right into its infrastructure, is all based on supply from Russia. Half of Germany gets its gas directly from Russia and nowhere else. This is an astonishing fact, and which we can only understand. It's not just that they were stupid. The whole design of German capitalism was based on the idea of cheap energy, but cheap energy from Russia, not from moving away from fossil fuels. And now they've been hoisted by their own petard. They found the contradiction, of that relationship. And are desperately trying to untangle this. now, why I just returned to this point about the politics of this, because now we see, the rise of ethno-nationalism, in Russia and throughout Eastern Europe, as people sort of try and define themselves, imperialism versus imperialism, country against country. And as monopolies rise and fall, as Ed correctly points out, we will see such tensions within imperialist blocs. It's not just that there's one ultra-imperialism and it's ruling the world. There's globalization, but imperialism is the political edge of globalization, and an alignment by great powers, or an expression of power by great powers, the physical intervention through armies and so forth. And Russia, coming down as a lower imperialist power, a lower capitalist power, is forced to use force, because it actually has no power at all in terms of its economic power. And so it has to use military intervention, to eventually achieve the markets that it wants in Ukraine. And it's succeeding in that sense, even during the war, at least for a time, being able to take over the apparatus, that it has in Ukraine. And I think we need to try and unpack this, because I think we're seeing Russia now defining itself as an Asian power. I see that some of those people who intervened in South Africa are Roy Singham. If you follow the Facebook, you'll see more about this. You'll see that there's an alliance now with the Chinese bureaucracy throughout the world to define Russia now as an Asian power. This goes back to debates, which run through Ukraine, which run through Russia itself. Is Russia actually to turn towards West? The West is not just capitalism. The West is also democracy. The rise of democratic forces in the sense of a middle-class capitalist order, which determines its politics through elections, as we see in Britain, and through parties, and not through autocracy, which is the rule which Lenin identified, as the Asian mode of rule, as opposed to the rule of production. And Lenin was oriented to the West. It looked to Germany, not to itself and elsewhere as a center of political power. And I think this helps to recast some of the politics, some of the development of political ideas and totally reactionary political forces, such as ethno-nationalism, to try and unpack, the understanding and also the politics that we need to adopt, to counter imperialism.
Thanks very much for that, David. Before I bring Eddie, there's a lot of people making some very good points in the chat. We've got plenty of room for discussion yet. Please put your hand up and make your point so we can all hear. That would be of great value. But there's quite a few people putting things in. And if anybody wants to say anything quickly, any of the people that have been in the chat, otherwise I'll bring Ed in. No? Okay, Ed.
I agree with you, Pam. I would willingly, as I've spoken once already, I would willingly stand down and let someone who's writing in the chat have a chance to, voice their points. I mean, in the meanwhile, I just want to come back on one or two things. That it is a very good discussion, and all comrades are making very thoughtful points. In relation to Matt's point that the war in Ukraine is not for markets, it's a war for domination. Actually, I don't see how you can split hairs like that. What is a market if it's not an aspect of domination? And what is a war for domination if it's not an attempt to reconfigure who controls the market? It's a completely undialectical approach to trying to analyze the causes and the backgrounds of this war. The other thing I wanted to say, this discussion has touched on the character of China, and that's a very, very important point in global economy today. And I think we have to devote a separate discussion to it. But for me, the absolute key thing is the economy of China susceptible to the fluctuations, the booms and slumps that the Western economies are subjected to because of all the trends in a capitalist economy that Bob McKee very often refers to, Michael Roberts very often refers to. The tendency of the rate of profit to fall, the unavoidable fluctuations of boom to slump and so on. And one of the comrades pointed this out, that the Chinese economy has continued to grow in the last 30 years, despite the fact that the economies of Europe, America, the rest of the world who are under the influence of Europe and America have been subjected to these fluctuations. Now, whether China remains doing that is a different question, because it's absolutely evident that there are many trends within the Chinese economy and pressure within the Chinese bureaucracy, on the part of some sections of the Chinese bureaucracy anyway, to move China to a more openly capitalist form of economy. But I don't think we're there yet. Like I say, that probably requires a separate discussion. The only other point I would like to just draw the attention of this meeting to is that, I mean, Themos's introduction was absolutely brilliant in illustrating the need for socialist revolution and how the need for socialist revolution globally should be presented. If there's one country in the world at the moment, as we speak, where the masses are getting near to the point of taking decisions which could lead to socialist revolution, it's Sri Lanka. And I think at least a moment ago, I saw he may have been cut off electronically because the community, but we do have Saranapala. If he can, I know it's not the main theme of this discussion, but if Saranapala can say a few words about what's happening in Sri Lanka, I think it would be a very good contribution to this meeting. But thank you for listening to me twice, comrades, even though probably other people have got a lot to say.
Thanks, Ed. Saranapala can't say a few words at the moment. I was going to talk about it at the end of the meeting when we talk about next week's meeting, but Saranapala has been up all day yesterday and pretty much all night in Colombo in a protest amongst the tear gas and the water cans and all the rest of it. He's absolutely exhausted, so that's why he's left the meeting. But I'll talk more about that next week, because he's going to give us an eyewitness report of what's going on, which is absolutely brilliant, actually. Right, so with no hands up at the moment, if people have put remarks in the chat, unfortunately remarks tend to get lost because you can't really read the chat and listen to the debates at the same time. So please, if you put something in the chat, you don't have to talk for 5 minutes, just make a quick point, and that would really enrich and broaden the discussion we're having. There's some very good stuff being put in. So I don't think, are there any offers, because we've no other hands up at the moment. Okay, Matt.
Thanks, comrades, for that. I think in terms of the war in Ukraine, it's clearly not a war for markets. What do the Russians want from Ukraine? They're not saying, they're not invading for the mineral resources or the right to sell stuff or the right to take over grain production. What they're invading Ukraine for is because they see themselves under threat from the Americans placing missiles on the Ukrainian border, within a few hundred, 100 miles of Moscow. That's what the war is about. It's not about markets in those terms. Okay, the broader sense, we can obviously see it in terms of the decline of capitalism and its tendency toward, capitalism had a tendency towards war. But if you look at, you can say this of a number of different wars. Whatever you say about Iraq, it wasn't a war for oil. It was a war in order to for the domination of the Middle East, to complete the disaster. And we can say the same about Afghanistan. I mean, what did Americans invade Afghanistan for? Certainly wasn't the minerals that was there. They didn't extract a single bean out of the place. They spent billions and trillions, actually trillions of dollars on controlling Afghanistan. Unbelievable, absolutely crazy in any logical sense, in many ways. But I mean, it's their effort to try and control space within the world, and the conditions in which clearly they see themselves as in a state of decline, and the fact that they were forced to scuttle out of Afghanistan, of course, was a huge blow to them throughout the whole, particularly the Middle East. And Central Asia. So I mean, obviously, we're back again to this. And the thing is, the real point, of course, is that actually all of this is leading up to the Americans see themselves principally in competition with the Chinese, and all of this is going around about the point that the Americans constantly make some points. Look, we are aiming at war with the Chinese, and this is going to happen sooner than you think. And the point is, how can the working class and the world's population say, no, you're not going to war with the Chinese, because it may be in your interest, but not in the interest of the world population. You're trying to kill us all, you rotten shower. And the point is, but actually need rid of this filthy system, which goes around killing people by the million, just so a few billionaires can run the world. It's ridiculous.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Jimmy?
There's just a little point I wanted to pick up on. I have mentioned in the chat that in Ireland, the government is in a position where it's a coalition government, but the components of that government, the major parties, are both in favour of joining NATO. If they had a choice, Ireland would be an active part, rather than it is at the moment a backdoor part of NATO. In the sense that we're providing facilities through Shannon and have been doing for years. Planes traveling to Afghanistan, planes traveling to Iraq, soldiers returning through and have their recreational time, all came in and out of Shannon with completely unchallenged. And that will continue. But there is one fly in the ointment for the government, and that is that the constitution of the state determines that we cannot enter into alliances without the will of the people being expressed through referendum. And the governments are quite realistic about this. They could not, in any hope, expect to win a referendum on this issue. And the reason for that is that it would have to take on the working class and its organisations, which would oppose it and defeat them. They would also have to face the opportunism of Sinn Féin, and the combined forces would not allow the government to win. And instead, it's much easier then to send the Prime Minister Taoiseach over to Ukraine bearing gifts under the counter and to do deals with Biden and that. Now, the only question that I wanted to ask, if there's any time for anybody to express opinion on it, is that in the recent cases of Finland and Sweden, where their commitment to NATO was done through parliamentary decisions, the question I ask is, does anybody have any knowledge that if the Swedish people and the Finnish people had an opportunity, as in Ireland, to express an opinion on that particular aspect of government policy, could the workers in Finland or could the workers in Sweden defeat that proposal? And if the other European countries had a chance, would they oppose it too? I'll just leave it at that.
Very good point. Thank you, Jimmy. Right. I think Peter just waving his hand about. I don't see any other hands up. Somebody has just made another point in the chat. Right, I'll take Jimmy's hand down. Hang on.
No, we'll go down.
It doesn't matter if you... Trying to work out if Peter's got his hand up, I don't think he has. Right, okay. We seem to have run out of contributions. I wish you wouldn't do that. We seem to have run out of contributions now. I don't know if people are still putting stuff in the chat they want to come back on. Otherwise, I think what we'll have to do is go back to Themos and see if he can, you know, take up some of the issues we've raised and you know, so on. Definitely nobody else wants to speak now. Right, Themos, do you want to come back and comment on, you know, what's been said? We can't hear you for some reason. Yeah, Themos, even though you're not muted, we can't hear you. You might need to go out to the meeting and come back in again. Are you going to do that? Yeah, okay. Just have to give Themos a minute to come back in because he's having trouble with his connection. He's obviously lost his sound now. So let's give him a couple of minutes.
While we're waiting for Themos, could I just ask a question? Does anybody, anybody have any viewpoints on the perspectives of an invasion of a section of Moldova and what the reaction would be there?
Okay. Anybody? Anybody at all? George? You're muted though, you'll have to unmute. George, you're muted.
I think you'll find that one of the objectives of Russia is to link up with Transnistria, which is an enclave on the edge of Moldova. I think there's about 60% of inhabitants in Transnistria who are Russophile. And I think possibly that will neutralize for a while any NATO incursion from Moldova itself. That's all I want to say. Another point which has been raised in the chat, and that is the fact that someone asserted that the 2014 coup in Ukraine was a revolutionary act, you know, I wish to dispel any you know, idea that the coup was revolutionary. The political forces in Ukraine, in control of the government, the defense and the interior ministry and other key ministerial areas, is predominantly fascist. And they have been an element in Ukraine in aiding and abetting the US and Western encroachment in Ukraine politics. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Themos, well, in your absence, a couple of hands have gone up. We're just discussing the possibility of invasion of Moldova. I'm just going to bring John or Dominic in. I think it's John, but whichever one it is, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, it's just a small point on Moldova. There was a report, I'm not sure if it was on Al Jazeera or one of the non-British news agencies on May Day, I think it was, in Moldova. And the report was that the vast majority of people who were involved in the celebrations, demonstrations, or whatever you on May Day in Moldova were wearing pro-Russian emblems, whereas the government in Moldova is very much lined up with other elements of wanting to join NATO, wanting to join the EU, etc. So I thought that was interesting, that while, you know, this wasn't in Transnistria or whatever we call it, but this was in the capital of Moldova, that this, if you like, quite clear demonstration that they were pro-Russian and not pro-West.
John?
That's it.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Themos, shall we see if your sound's working now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I think so. You're a bit quiet.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
That's okay, yeah.
First of all, I would prefer not to get bogged down in details. And what I'm saying is that trying to find what is going on in every single detail event, it's not something that is easy, and it's probably not very relevant for the big picture. What I'm saying is that we are living in the terminal decline of today's capitalism. That we have a capitalism that is not the way capitalism used to do, and it's working through the planning of these monopolies. And these monopolies are ripe for appropriation. They are ripe for socialism, and we can, by taking these few monopolies over, we could transition to social very easily. But of course, taking them over is not easy. So revolution becomes more of a political rather than an economic question these days. And what we should realize is that this affects our own strategy of how it's going, what's going to happen. If we see how Syriza came close to changing Europe, if we see how Corbyn came close to realizing a real challenge to the political power in Britain, or Bernie Sanders for that matter, in America. Now, these would of course meet with the resistance of all the forces of reaction, the military, the police, etc. But this is what we should be discussing about, and not the details. As far as the question of whether Russia is imperialist or not, of course there are differences. You don't have the same situation in America or Europe with Russia. It's completely different. But the basic issue is that, again, there we have capitalism with a few monopolies dominating the economy and being a threat to their own people, but also to the West. And the West perceives them as a danger. And as long as the West didn't have problems before 2008, they were very happy to try to integrate both China and Russia in the world capitalist system. But then a stage came that this couldn't be done. The West was too weak for that. They were afraid of China. They were afraid of Russia. And they did everything in their power to contain them. Again, we had a containment strategy, trying to minimize as much as possible the possibility of China or Russia to become a real competitor. We have seen how they behave toward China, excluding Huawei, this huge Chinese company from competing in the West. I mean, it was just a capitalist company competing for a capitalist share of a capitalist world, but they couldn't have that. And they were afraid of Russia because they have the military muscle. And in this sense, it is a defensive war from Putin, but a defense to defend what? He's not defending Russia and his people. He's defending the gangsters who are ruling Russia. And in this sense, I think we can see that he considers his immediate neighborhood as his own sphere of influence. Georgia, Ukraine, and a lot of other countries, probably Finland and Sweden in a different sense. But this was his area that he wanted to defend for Russian capitalism. And in this sense, they are behaving as an imperialist country. There are differences, we could discuss them, and we could find whatever we want, but these are the realities. And this, if we come to Ukraine, if we see what the Western press was printing after 1914, after 2014, just before the Ukrainian, we shall see that they were really worried about what was happening in Ukraine, how Ukraine was taken over by fascists and this sort of thing. And all this, Putin changed it. And he changed it because that's the only thing he could do. So he attacked, and it was rightly said that he managed to strengthen NATO. He managed to make Europe just irrelevant. And European capitalism, once more, is becoming directly under the leadership of the USA. And the USA is as much imposing its own power to the world as in Europe as well. So we have here capitalist countries competing with each other, and for various reasons they clash together. And we do have this situation where Putin's invasion has to be opposed, and of course, a Putin victory is no better than an American victory. And opposing Putin should not be done together with the NATO alliance, the most reactionary structure on the planet today. It should be done by the working class. It should be done by the forces of the working class, and which should oppose both the Russian invasion, but to oppose it effectively, it has to oppose Zelensky and the puppets of the West there. So it's something that has to be, we have to be careful about that. And we should realize that this is not happening in normal times, that we have the next 50 years of capitalism, which is going to develop uninterruptedly, and we are picking up one thing here and one thing there. We are living in an era of revolution, in which economically is an era of mature capitalism ready for socialist transformation. And that's the main thing that I think we should be careful. We should not forget that in each and every country in the West and elsewhere, revolutionary movements are growing up fast, and we see explosions every day. And these explosions should be seen as part of this whole world picture. We should not get only specific and separate analysis of each situation. We should see this as a result of the really revolutionary world situation we are living today. Now, I would also be careful when we see people like Trump, and we try to say that Trump represents the big monopolies. He doesn't. In fact, Trump was based on masses who are really pissed off with the big monopolies, with the political establishment that favors these monopolies, that makes their lives difficult. And we live today in a situation where a handful of capitalists, the big monopolies, they call all the shots, and the vast majority of capitalists is under threat, and it will be more and more under threat. They are losing the grip of their power, they are losing the control. And we should be, we should realize that. I mean, it's if you see how Biden is behaving today, it's just like an absolute ruler of the world, and he has all the structures of capitalism working for him, all the information in his hands. And if we want to see how the Americans see Russians and Chinese, we can only go to a recent speech by Pompeo, the ex, I think it was foreign secretary, who says clearly that China is a great danger and it has to be contained. And he talks about the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to do that. And it is an opportunity to do that. Putin gave them this opportunity. Because invading Ukraine, it cannot be defended in any sense, except for in the sense of protecting the interests of his gangster capitalism that he's building. And I want to repeat what I said before, that if we want to be serious about revolution, we have to see that it's in the West that the final chapter will be written. It's in the West that the traditions of democracy exist. It's in the West that capitalism has all the parameters to get transformed into a planned system. And if it is planned by the working class, it will be a socialist system. And any other explosion here and there in Sri Lanka, in India, in Latin America, even China and Russia, but there we have to discuss that a bit more detail. It will end up in a question: will Western capitalism be transformed to socialism? Will it be overthrown? Because if it isn't, there is no chance today for any long-term socialism in one country anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Themos. Unless there's any last-minute comments, I think we've reached the end of the discussion for today, really. I don't see anybody putting their hand up. No, okay, well, I want to thank Themos for that, the lead off and the, summing up as well. Thank everybody else for the contributions. I think, we've actually had a very good discussion. So thank you very much. So just wanted to talk about next week. Roger normally does this, but he's not here, as I said earlier on. As comrades know, there are some cataclysmic events happening in Sri Lanka that essentially, due to a number of factors, including government mishandling, Sri Lanka is now bankrupt. And there's been a campaign lasting for weeks to get the president to resign. And he has refused to resign. So yesterday there was a national demonstration called in Colombo, and it was absolutely huge. And it's I don't know if comrades have seen any of the footage, but it culminated in the protesters managing to push the army aside and storm the presidential palace. And the protests went on around for a long time after that. So next week's meeting, Saranapala, of course, is our contact in Sri Lanka. He was actually on site when all this was going on, so he's going to report back on that and also talk about the current situation in Sri Lanka and what the potential is for the future. So basically that's the same time next week, and I hope you can all come. Okay. Right, nothing else, so I declare the meeting closed and hope to see you next week.
Sorry, just before we close.
Yes, David, yes, sorry.
Sorry to pop in, I had to leave for a while. Please, comrades who are, have a look at our WIN Facebook. There's a struggle taking place in the South African unions, which is of enormous significance. SAFTU is the Left Union Federation, has called for the ANC to be removed from government. So the workers now have put out a call for the ANC Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, to resign, and the ANC to be taken out of government. I think they use the word resign. Now, in response to that, some of the leading activists who are, it happened to be women, have been told that they'll be suspended in their unions for making such a call. And so please, if you can go to our WIN Facebook, I'm sorry, I should have posted the link now, but go there and support those workers who are about to be suspended for taking a very courageous action and for opposing the domination of, particularly of one union, by US capitalists with lots of money.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Well, I mean, in general, please do look at the WIN Facebook pages and contribute things. Unfortunately, the same people keep contributing stuff, and we would welcome contributions from people other than David Hemson himself. But please just share bits of stuff that's going on, even if it's just a short post. We really do need a dialogue going on the Facebook page as well. Okay. So Themos, could you send your presentation to Roger and we'll ask him to distribute it? Is that all right?
The presentation to Roger, yes.
That's great. Matthew, did you want to say something? I think I saw your hand go up. No, you didn't, no. Okay, so, that will get email around to everybody in due course when Roger gets to it. Okay. Anything else, anybody? No? In that case, to declare the meeting closed. We'll see you next week. Bye for now. Bye.
Right.
Bye.